I'm Mick O'Regan. This is our first webinar for 2021. Doesn't it feel great that we've got a new year at last? 2020 seemed to go on for about a decade, I thought. Anyway, tonight we're going to be, our theme is Electrifying Your World. We're going to be talking about LEVs. We're going to be talking about electric tipper trucks. We're going to be talking about electric scooters delivering pizzas. And we're going to be joined by two men, both of whom have really great track records in electric vehicles, Wolfgang Roffmann and Glen Walker. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce them more formally when we kick over again. But this is our sixth webinar in the series. They've been really interesting so far. I've got no doubt this will also be another really interesting webinar. Glen Walker is from the company C Electric, and Wolfgang Rothman is from eMotion Concepts. That's the company. The brand is EMOS. And when we do formally begin the program, I'll give you a fuller introduction to both our guests tonight. And I'll also mention, and I'll mention them now and again, our wonderful sponsors. Our principal sponsor is Bank Australia. Our major sponsor is NRMA. And our community sponsors are Inova Community Energy, Light Touch Solar and Electrical, and Club Car. And I just always want to acknowledge how important it is that we do have those sponsors, because without that sponsorship, we can't do this webinar series. So we really very much appreciate the support we get from those companies. So look, I will, as I said, we'll formally get underway. Just to give you a pointer to when the next webinar will be, which is in the Tuesday, the 2nd of March, and that'll be on electric bikes and micro mobility. Of course, not everyone wants or needs to drive a car. So for that webinar, we're really inviting people to come along and find out about personal modes of electric transport. But what we might do now, I think we've reached a point where we can begin tonight's webinar. So here we go. Hello and welcome to this Zero Emissions Byron webinar on the electrical vehicle revolution. My name's Mick O'Regan, and it's my great pleasure to be the moderator tonight. This evening, it's webinar number 6 and our first for the new year, 2020. Sorry, 2021. There you go. 2020 seemed to go on forever and it's still in my head. But no, 2020 is gone. It's 2021, and this is webinar number 6 for Zero Emissions Byron. And our theme tonight is Electrifying Your World. Before we kick off tonight's discussion, I want to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I'm speaking from, the northeast coast of New South Wales, and that's the people of the Bundjalung Nation. And I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Next, I'd like to warmly thank our sponsors. Our principal sponsor is Bank Australia. Our major sponsor is NRMA, and our community sponsors are Inova Community Energy, Light Touch Solar and Electrical, and Club Car. Thank them all very much for making this webinar series possible. This evening, we're getting our motors running and rolling out onto the highway, battery charged, emissions free, and heading into the future. And we have two fantastic guests to guide us along our way. Wolfgang Rothman from the company eMotion Concepts is better known, I suppose, as the brand EMOS. Wolfgang is the founder and chief technical officer of eMotion Concepts. It's a Brisbane-based company founded in 2016, dedicated to LEVs, which you'll all know are light electric vehicles, for the transport of people and goods in urban environments. Wolfgang has a long history in technology-driven early-stage companies in medical devices, telecommunications, and the automotive industries. And he has degrees in both medical physics from Germany and a master's in technology and innovation management from the University of Queensland. It's great that Wolfgang has joined us tonight. Of course, eMotion Concepts is the company and EMOS is the brand. Our other guest is Glen Walker from C Electric, that's SEA Electric. Glen is the regional director in Oceania for C Electric, a Melbourne-based electric truck developer that also has a significant US and European footprint. They take existing commercial vehicle platforms and fit them with their patented C-Drive technology, and then they deploy customized electric drivetrain solutions for numerous requirements. In fact, recently in Australia, C Electric supplied the first all-electric tipper truck to the city of Yarra, and then recently another to the ACT government. So that's real innovation in a big way. They've also supplied solutions to all-electric garbage trucks and cherry pickers, as well as heavy-duty delivery trucks. A warm, emissions-free, zero-emissions Byron welcome to both of you, and for everyone joining us wherever you are. So let's get the ball rolling with Wolfgang. Wolfgang, again, welcome. What can you tell us about light electrical vehicles and your company EMOS selling last mile and personal transport solutions? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mick. And let me please acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land we meet today, and the elders past and present. Thank you very much. I will share a presentation with you and talk a little bit about LEVs as the unsung heroes of the transport electrification, and making sort of the case for power 2- and 3-wheelers vehicles for transport of goods and people. And to do that, I would like to set the scene, and I think it's important to set the scene because everyone who is in the electric vehicle world always talks about electric vehicles as being electric cars, but there's quite a few other vehicles electrified around, and some of them have much wider distribution than your electric car. So LEVs as the unsung, we'll go on then to the LEVs as the unsung heroes of transport electrification and the virtues of battery swap. And if we get the time and I'm not cut off at some stage, you know, or someone, we get sidetracked, I would like to talk a little bit about LEVs as beyond the personal transport and the micro logistics and hyperlocal delivery. So let me start with setting the scene. And the scene is really that we are looking at Australia and the world being far more urbanized these days. By 2030, it's expected that 60% of the population will live in cities. And as we see here with the urban centers over the last few thousand years, we have seen them grow and grow and grow. For the developed world, we're looking at about 86% will live in cities within the next 10 years. So everywhere where we have a light, this is where people will live, and they will be all clustered together. So in Australia, quite amazingly, we already have 86% of people living in urban environments. And to a surprise, 64% of people living in Australia living in the top 5 cities and 72 in the top 10 cities. So that leads me then to car ownership. So car ownership currently in the world is about 1.2 billion cars worldwide, with an estimated growth to 2 billion worldwide by 2030. Australia, in terms of car ownership per 1,000 population, is in the top 10, and I think it's number 6, you know, which we can see here. Oops. Sorry. Typical. So let's have a quick look at the car ownership in Australia. And I will get to the LEVs, but I think it's important to see our fascination with cars in the world, being it internal combustion engines or electric vehicles. Yeah. So 788 motor vehicles per 1,000 population. That's amazing, you know, as well as there's 74% in Australia are passenger cars. And that almost ties up with every person who has a full car license having a car. Statistics, of course. You know, moving on. Why is this moving on? Sorry. Yeah, here. So now the vehicle usage is another interesting part, you know, in low car occupancy, particularly for the drives to work. And in some areas, we're looking actually at almost 1 person per car. And that's why we're getting all these wonderful car traffic jams in the morning. The average vehicle distance is surprisingly low, you know, per day, per person, with just about 36.4 kilometers per day. And trips, which are average lengths of 8.5 kilometers per trip, with more of half those trips being less than 4 kilometers. So Now, the other interesting part in the car saga is that cars are parked for almost 95% of the time, which basically means that per week, we're really just having 6 hours in a car, while the remaining 162 hours are spent sitting somewhere without doing anything. So Ozzy Zena, in his book, Green Illusions, mentioned that we don't actually have an energy crisis, we have a consumption crisis. And to explain this, we really have to look at, for instance, a car. Using a 1,000-kilogram vehicle, which is a typical hatchback car, to move 75 kilograms, for me it's a little bit more, of human means that only 7% of the energy is propelling the person, with 93% just moving the car itself. Larger and heavier cars are even worse, and this is absurdly wasteful. So what is an LEV? LEV stands for light electric vehicles. And there is heaps of vehicles within this category. The Light Electric Vehicle Association in Europe includes the following electric vehicles, ranging from electric bicycles to quadricycles. And one of the things here is that in Australia, and I will come to this in a second, we don't have actually the electric bicycles as a road vehicle, and we also don't have a category for the quadricycles. Furthermore, the Light Electric Vehicle Association in Europe also includes self-balancing vehicles, electric scooters, electric monowheels. So in Australia, these parts here are called non-road vehicles. And you will be surprised, this is what Australia looks like. The bicycles are basically in the non-road vehicles and do not need registration or driver's licensing and so forth. Unlike in Europe, where these vehicles can be up to 1,000 watts, we only allow 250 watts. We don't have a limited speed moped, which can be driven in Europe for 14 years of age. The categories are very similar in that way. L1 is LA, L2 is LB, and so forth. So we have the mopeds, three-wheel mopeds, motorcycles, motorcycle with a sidecar, and a tricycle. In Australia, we don't have any of these quadricycles. And one of the issues here is that the Renault Twizy, which is a wonderful little vehicle in Europe, cannot be brought into Australia because we do not have the heavy quadricycle category in Australia. Coming back to our non-road vehicles, which are termed in Australia personal mobility devices, electric scooters, which you see here, are only legal in Queensland, ACT, and the Northern Territory. So I want to concentrate here a little bit on these parts, which are usually termed PTWs. PTW stands for powered two, or for that matter, three-wheelers. So from powered two-wheelers to electric powered two-wheelers. Powered two or three-wheelers are dominant forms in transport in many countries and very prolific in the Asian region, with up to 500 vehicles per 1,000 population in Vietnam, Thailand, and India. And if anyone has ever been there, you see all the people driving on the scooters and tuk-tuks and so forth. It falls pretty quickly off, and Australia is in the 37th position here. So, particularly in some of the Asian countries, as I mentioned, which are the red parts here, we have per household, that's not per population, that's per household, in some areas over 80% availability to a PTW per household. So, although they are not as prevalent in the Western countries, PTWs are also popular choices. And again, if you have been in the Mediterranean, you will see the scooters, the Vespa scooters, and so forth in Spain or in Italy. Greece is a surprising thing, and we included China as a westernized country because they have a very important part to play in terms of the electrification of these PTWs. So, the Bloomberg 2020 electric vehicle outlook states that there are over 900 million mopeds, scooters, motorcycles in the world. That includes internal combustion engines as well as electric. Surprisingly, 20% of these are already electrified. That is 184 million mopeds, scooters, and motorcycles on the road. Whereas the electric cars are now at about 7 million passenger EVs on the road. Now here's the kicker. China accounts for the bulk of these two-wheeler or three-wheeler electrifications to date. As you see, the red parts here is China, and we've got the rest of the world, and we got a little bit. I think it said actually that Japan and South Korea are not visible because they're too small for this. Globally, 30% of new two and three-wheeler sales are electric, but also growing rapidly. And it's estimated that by 2040, the sales will reach 77%, with the total fleet being at 47, almost 50% of the fleet being electrified. So let me move on to the virtues of battery swap for LEVs. So the pros of battery swapping are that if we look at the issues with EV adoption, is that there's always the issue of high upfront cost, range anxiety, long charging, and the absence of reliable supportive infrastructure. Battery swap can provide a reduction in EV acquisition costs, since the battery is at sometimes up to 50% in the total cost of an EV. The eliminating of long charging, since the swapping of a battery can be as fast as filling up your tank. Range anxiety and higher efficiencies. A network of swapping stations similar to fuel stations for quick exchange would reduce the range anxiety, but also would actually increase the efficiencies for vehicles, since we do not have to have larger batteries, which contribute to the weight of the vehicle, which has to be moved. The equivalent infrastructure, we know that chargers and fast chargers do actually take quite a lot of infrastructure into consideration, like, for instance, the power cables and so forth, as well as the time it takes in terms of the parking sites, as well as the stations. Another advantage could be a longer battery life. Fast charging and charging in high ambient temperatures can lead to degradation, and with swapped batteries, they could be charged via slow charging in controlled environments. The other thing with the battery charging is, for instance, that we always hear that, oh, I charge my electric vehicle on solar, but most of the time you're actually not at home where your solar installation is. And therefore, at night, the sun doesn't shine, and the only way you can go forward then with this is basically by having another battery installation at home to store the solar charges, the solar power, and then charge from the battery to another battery. Whereas if you have swappable batteries, you could have two smaller size batteries, one which charges during the day from solar, while the other one is in use. I guess the other thing is that we can actually also check the batteries a lot better and know when they're ready for recycling, disposal, or reconfiguration. So battery swapping for EV cars has been suggested for quite some time. At an event in 2013, Tesla showcased battery swap technology to demonstrate that it's possible to replace a Model S battery in less than it times takes to fill a tank. Tesla abandoned that idea, and the problem was probably, I hope this is working. Yep. The problem probably was that it was a little bit too difficult. I'm just kidding. So this is obviously a little bit of a joke on the battery swap for the Teslas. But in saying that, and more recently, the Chinese automaker NIO has succeeded where Tesla could not, completing 500,000 battery swaps in its home market, China, as of 26th of May, 2020, just over 2 years after the first battery swap station opened. So There are, however, very high complexities in achieving battery swap for electric cars, with several issues arising mostly from the size, with volumes from 200 to 400 plus liters, and the weight, for instance, for a Nissan Leaf 40 kilowatt hour battery being larger than 200, and a Tesla 100 kilowatt hour battery being larger than 600 kilograms. And amongst the problems are obviously the actual handling of the weight and size of batteries, storage, recharging, and another issue is the standardization between different cars. So the virtues, common battery sizes for LEVs are much, much smaller, which makes the battery swap for LEVs something which we can actually do quite easily. The common battery size are usually range from 600 watt hours for your e-bikes to 15 kilowatt hours, for instance, for a Harley Livewire. But in the lower speed electric powered two-wheelers, like the mopeds and sit-down scooters, they're actually around 2 kilowatt hours with weights below 15 kilos. Sorry. One is standing in the way of wider adoption. One thing that stands in the way of wider adoption of battery swapping station is the non-existing standard for light electric vehicle batteries in terms of sizes, voltages, connections, and some other issues. At this moment, there's only one light electric vehicle OEM company called Gogoro in Taiwan that has such a product in the market. Gogoro Network, only in Taiwan, a collection of over 1,000 battery swap stations spread around Taiwan. So I know I'm aware of time, so I just want to give a little bit of a quick introduction about our range of vehicles, ranging from the mobility devices like a scooter to basically our fun e-chopper, the Wild. In between, we like the three-wheelers because they're retargeting the non-motorcycle community, get people back into a bike. Interesting fact too is that there are 880,000 motorcycles currently registered, but at the same time, there's 2.2 million people with motorcycle driver's licenses. So the question is, where are the 13,000+ people, you know, which are, or the, what, sorry, 1.3 million people which have a motorcycle license but not using it. Another area which we're doing is light electric vehicles for delivery of goods, and they range from the CT Cube to the CT Cargo Cool, which is a vehicle for inner city deliveries and which can maintain the cold chain. Obviously, our target markets are mail, e-parcel deliveries, municipal maintenance and building services, supermarkets, customized business concepts. And one of those customized business concepts is what we call the down the shop local. And I'm not going into much detail, but it's a cooperative hyperlocal last mile delivery concept, which brings your local shops together to share a delivery service. This is our lineup. There's actually a few more vehicles which we now have in our lineup too, but all of these vehicles are available now with full Australian road certification compliance. And to stop off, I want to give you a little taste of our Wild. I hope you have time. This is going on for half an hour. No, I'm kidding. Thank you very much. Sorry, Mick, you're on. Yeah.
Sorry, no, I was just trying to unmute myself. I think we probably should call you Steppen Wolfgang after that. Great. Also, just a couple of quick things, Wolfgang. First of all, thank you for your presentation. What happens to the batteries when they're no longer useful for powering transport?
Well, for power and transport, we have things in line for a circular economy setup where we will repurpose them. So whilst they're not useful for the transportation anymore, they're still useful for energy and solar power requirements.
Right. Okay. Look, we'll come back to some questions in a moment, but I want to quickly move on now to Glen Walker. And Glen, I'd like to invite you to do your presentation.
So I'm just going to unshare this here. Yeah, stop share. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much, Mick. And welcome to my humble presentation on Sea Electric's products, specifically in the light and medium duty truck segment. So who are we? Sea Electric is an electric truck manufacturer and a facilitator of the creation of electric trucks. We have a patented C-Drive technology, which allows a rapid integration across multiple truck and van platforms. And the C-Drive technology is a combination of, I guess, the componentry, the ease with which it's assembled into the vehicle, and a pretty clever series of zeros and ones that controls all of the batteries and all of the electrical components. We target, I guess, cost of ownership significantly during our process. And it does have a competitive cost of ownership compared with the competition, which is predominantly diesel. The company was founded in 2012, offices in a large part of the world, as you can see there. We've produced over 100 vehicles so far, and we have a total of 1 million miles of experience across those vehicles, as well as all of the test vehicles that we undertook in the early days of our product development. We have a broad product range, it's here now, and it's ready to go. We do still offer the ability to repower existing diesel vehicles, but in a world where we're trying to have a small environmental footprint, that does introduce an element of waste to the process. You're throwing away perfectly good engines, transmissions, radiators, exhaust systems, and so on. And by going to a semi-knockdown kit, so we basically purchase truck components, we can fit more of them into shipping containers, so we reduce freight costs. We only buy what we need, so we reduce purchasing costs. And by having the ability to assemble in our factory, we greatly improve efficiency, build quality, and we can fine-tune our design. We market these products under our own brand, Sea Electric, and they're available in gross vehicle masses of 4.5 tonne through to 23.5 tonne. So picture a 23.5 tonne is a rigid truck with one front axle and two rear axles, and a 4.5 tonne is a little car license, could be a delivery van, or you see here a little delivery truck. We also market the products through dealerships located around Australia as far north as Cairns, moving through Brisbane, Sydney, Newcastle, the ACT, Albury, Wodonga specifically, Melbourne, Tasmania, Adelaide, and Perth. So a truck available through dealers nationwide. Here is a representation of one of our electric trucks. This is a little car license 4.5 tonne. I've deliberately made a nice little picture here with a friendly power cord to show it's electric. Nice green leaves, friendly, nice little truck. What should the competition look like? Well, I'll suggest it's a non-emotional, non-confrontational, CO2 emitting existing diesel vehicle. First thing they have to do is satisfy two things. One is called startability, the other is gradability. One is the measure of the slope of the angle of the hill that you can start the vehicle from rest. And the other is the speed that a vehicle will maintain on a given grade. And our electric vehicles are at least the same or materially the same. Here is a little graph. A diesel vehicle has a startability of 28%. Ours has 23. You have to have a handbrake that will allow your vehicle to stay stationary on an 18-degree slope. So it doesn't really make much difference how far above that you are, as long as you are above it. In vehicle performance, so gradability, our vehicle is actually superior to the diesel. And you can see the impact of the gear changes that affect the diesel vehicle as well. Another way you measure the performance of vehicles is range. Predominantly the distance a vehicle will travel on a single charge or a single fill. And of course, the time to charge and recharge or fill is a relevant measure as well. Our truck, this particular truck, 230 kilometers, fully loaded, 3 hours to charge from empty. The comparable diesel, roughly 500 kilometers, and as long as it takes to go to the service station, fill it up and pay for it. And this is where range anxiety that Wolfgang was talking about comes in. The reality is 230 kilometers is what most, between 60 and 70% of the trucks of this nature will do on any given day, period. So looking at range, our vehicles are targeted at start at base, do their job, and return to base at the end of the day where the charging infrastructure lives. They can start full and return empty, like this particular vehicle delivering food. And that's what we call last mile, because that's the last mile the freight goes through before it ends up at your house. This particular vehicle here is the City of Yarra tipper. It's what we would call first mile. So it's starting empty, picking up lots of bits and pieces, returning full to the transfer station, dumping it off, and then doing it all over again. There's roughly 300,000 rigid vehicles registered in Australia, 60% of which would do less than 200 kilometres in a day. 2.6 and some change kilograms of CO2 for every litre of diesel. There's roughly 8,000 tonnes of CO2 emitted from these vehicles every day. And that's just the light and medium duty truck segment that we're talking about. So tare weight, gross weight and payload. Tare weight is what the vehicle weighs parked on the ground. Gross weight is what it's allowed to carry. And payload, or what is it allowed to weigh, I beg your pardon, and payload is a difference between the two. In other words, how much you can earn money from. This vehicle, total mass of 4.5 tonne, it's a car licensed truck. Its tare is 2.4 tonne, therefore it has a payload of 2.1 tonne. Compared to the diesel, its tare is about 400 kilograms less. Therefore, its earning capacity is 400 kilograms more. Most trucks in this segment cube out before they weigh out. They run out of space before they run out of axle capacity. So at a 400 kilogram tare weight penalty, that is not something that we have too many problems selling against. Maintenance costs, predominantly what keeps a vehicle on the road. A diesel, a hypothetical diesel, will cost about X $1,000 a year in maintenance costs. Ours will be roughly 2/3 of that. So there's a saving in maintenance, fewer moving parts, less oils and fluids, simpler to service and maintain. Less brake wear because you're regenerating all the time. Fuel costs. Our humble little electric vehicle will cost you between 0 and 10 cents per kilometre. 0 if you're lucky enough to have a big enough solar array and a battery storage at your depot. The diesel, roughly 50 cents per kilometre to run that particular truck. So as you can see, this is the area where you get most bang for your buck in terms of lower cost of ownership. Purchase price. what a vehicle costs, not rocket science. Australia is unique in the world with EVs. We have a unique system where we penalise and tax owners who buy EVs. Because they're more expensive, we pay more stamp duty. In most other countries, there's actually an incentive at the moment to tip your toe in the water. And there's a couple of states who have recently said they'll put another tax on electric vehicles to replace the fuel excise, which is a federal tax that they're not paying. And so from a purchase price, if the diesel costs roughly X thousand dollars, the electric truck is between 2 and 2.5 times as expensive as the diesel. And that's all in the battery. The weight penalty and the cost penalty is all in the battery. They're coming down in price, they're coming down in weight, and they're improving in energy output. In the last 2 years, you can now squeeze an extra 20% worth of energy into the same battery. Now, people are taking that energy and keeping the battery weight and cost. One day we'll get to the point where that additional energy density will be served to reduce the cost of the battery and reduce the weight of the battery. We're not there yet. CO2 emissions, noise, and fatigue. Our truck, 0 emissions, less noise and less fatigue. And to drive one is to believe that. They're quiet, and they don't smell, and they don't vibrate. In this vehicle here, roughly 75 tonne of CO2 every year, more noise, more fatigue. Price. The premium that a customer, so someone who owns the freight and is moving it, is prepared to pay to have their freight moved by an EV. In other words, how much more will a customer pay to move freight on this electric truck versus this diesel truck? Very simple answer, 0. They won't pay more. So we have to justify this truck with no subsidies and show the client that over the whole of life, you can cart, you can charge the same per pallet space rate, and this vehicle will ultimately cost you less to own than this vehicle will. In summary, this one has the same performance, more noise, more fatigue, more maintenance, more fuel, more CO2. Weighs less, therefore it has more hypothetical payload, most customers don't need. It's got more hypothetical range, which most customers don't need. Our vehicle here is the exact opposite. Less noise, less fatigue, less maintenance, fuel, no CO2, and so on. And what we're finding too with our fast charge batteries, we can put roughly 25% additional charge into this vehicle in a lunch hour. So we're slowly getting beyond that range anxiety factor as well. And our vehicles have a lower whole of life operating cost, especially with innovative finance packages. Little example of what we've built. You can see some of the refuse vehicles dotted around here. This one here is a 23.5 tonne temperature controlled truck. The batteries control everything. They control the fridge motor. They obviously control the vehicle propulsion, the brakes, the air conditioning system, and the heater. And they also control an electric tailgate at the back of the vehicle. So the batteries do run everything. This vehicle here, a cherry picker, they run everything on that as well, including 240 volt power tools. And this little vehicle here is a road service vehicle, which also controls all of the power tools usage as well. So the batteries are called upon to do lots of different things. The market in class 4 to 7, roughly 250,000 units each year in North America and Europe, so call it 500,000 vehicles there. In Australia, light duty and medium duty, 22,000 vehicles in that category every year, emitting roughly 1.75 million tonnes of CO2. Just those vehicles sold each year. And for the purpose of today's discussion, globally, call it 750,000 of these things are sold every year. Transport, and what we're talking about here, the red line, the amount of CO2 emitted by transport, that's what's happening in Australia compared with what's happening with electricity. Electricity is coming down. All of our renewables is having an impact. For transport, not enough yet. And we've got the potential to save lots and lots and lots of CO2 by moving across to perfectly acceptable application-suited electric trucks. Where one of the other benefits will come from electric truck ownership and indeed significant numbers of these electric trucks, there's technology available today that if there's 500 of these trucks connected to the grid, that's the equivalent of one Tesla battery, the $30 million or $70 million facility that's in South Australia. And the technology is able to monitor each and every one of those 500 batteries. What's happening to their cells? What's happening to their energy usage? What's happening to their charging, regeneration? In other words, how much energy is stored and what it's currently being used for in each of those 500 batteries, this hypothetical Tesla battery. And that truck, which in the depot here, which has a solar array on its roof, it's purchasing renewables through the grid and charging trucks. This truck can also be a giver as well as a taker. It can supply energy back into the grid. And one of these batteries, for example, Wolfgang was talking about repurposing, same thing. Ultimately, when these batteries in 10, 15 years time, they'll be repurposed and they'll sit in someone's garage or they'll sit in the basement of a building downtown. And in someone's garage, one of their batteries would run your house for maybe 6 weeks. But the ability to supply backwards and forwards gives a huge opportunity for grid stabilization using the collective resources of these mobile batteries, and indeed third-party infrastructure that can vertically integrate batteries and actually own the batteries and have that as part of the energy supply solution that they have in their poles and wires. So that's C Electric. I wanted to keep the presentation today practical because at the end of the day, we make trucks. They work, they cart freight, and one day they'll quietly pick up your rubbish and deliver your Amazon parcels. So thanks for listening.
That was great. Thank you very much, Glenn. Look, we'll go to some questions now that people have been listening in. Both great presentations, gentlemen, really interesting. Glenn, just to let people know, if they wanted to find out about C Electric dealerships in Australia, there's one specific question about Newcastle, for example, but where could people find out details on the dealerships?
Best to work through our website and contact us through there. We're just in the process of setting up the dealer network. So I've given, the listeners today an advanced tease of what's going on. But if you approach us through the website, we will personally reach out to you and personally put you in touch with the relevant dealer. And yes, there is one in Newcastle ready to take your call.
Great, thanks. Wolfgang, there's been a question from Alexander about the prospects of some EV tri-wheelers for commuting. For example, Trike or Akamoto or River Simple Rasa or Unity. Do you have some ideas on what those prospects are? You might need to unmute.
Yeah, sorry.
That's
Look,
right.
We actually, but when I started with the company, the first vehicle we actually brought in was the CB by Clean Motion, a company in Sweden which won the Sandstrom Award. It was basically a sandwich fiberglass construction and looked quite spacey. But it was more like a tuk-tuk with one driver in the front and two passengers in the back. Unfortunately, the Swedish company went downhill a little bit with COVID, and we came very close actually to have a trial for a taxi service in Cairns. Yeah, so but that has now gone. Akimoto and other companies, it is quite interesting in Australia when we look back at my presentation when we were talking about the quadricycles. The Renault Twizy, or recently the Citroën has developed a quite cute sort of electric vehicle, which is actually a shared vehicle as well. These vehicles cannot come into Australia. Australia does not have a category for them. And we're missing out on some of the electric urban transport vehicles here in Australia because of our Motor Vehicle Standards Act.
And an interesting extension to that, Wolfgang, too, is our Australian design rules haven't kept up with the technology either, because we have to let the regulator know how many cylinders our engine has. It has none. We have to let them know what fuel it's powered by, diesel, gas, or petrol. It's neither. We have to do a drive-by noise test. We have to do a stationary noise test.
Yeah. We are actually exempt from the drive-by noise test, from the stationary noise test.
Well done, you.
For our vehicles, we still have to do the drive-by noise test, you know. And when it's quite funny in that way, when we did this, actually, there was one really peak, you know, and we tried to work out where it came from, and it was actually a train down the road going past.
Have to turn the radio off in the car.
Yeah, so, you can't breathe when you do those tests.
so Greg, for someone who's listening or watching us tonight, and they've got a fleet of trucks, they're interested in electric trucks, what do they do to prepare? What are the first steps you'd take?
The first steps fundamentally are your application. We work very closely with a prospective client on what it is they want to do. So what is their normal freight profile like? What sort of trucks do they have? What areas do they operate in? So we really do focus on the applications that have about the 250 kilometers in a day, give or take. They can be fast charged during the day, but it's that's the main criteria that gets you, okay, we're past the first hurdle and we're on the home straight. But we work very, very closely with each client to make sure that the experience will be as positive as it can be. So they're not for everybody. You won't see, you know, 3 trailers behind an electric truck with multiple decks of cattle halfway between Adelaide and Darwin anytime soon.
Right.
But certainly in the urbanized Australia, in capital cities, most of the 2-axle trucks are very, very well suited to an electric application.
Right. So in that sense, can electric trucks be made to order?
Yes.
Okay. And is there, and I'm not sure of this question, but I'm going to ask it, is there the prospect that a major electrification of the trucks that we have, would they create too much demand on the grid?
It depends at what time of day they're charged. Most of them will be charged overnight. Now that will have challenges for the grid in a strange way, because you don't get too many renewables into the grid overnight. So, you know, there are considerations to be had about when those vehicles charge and when they don't. And there are technologies available today that monitor and manage very carefully which vehicle gets the prioritized charging based on which vehicle has to leave first. And by doing that, you manage effectively the size of the cable that you need. I mean, that's a very simplistic explanation, but the infrastructure that's required to get the energy into your facility to charge those vehicles, if you're able to manage it properly, you don't have as much of a problem. And we've got clients that I mean, this is literally the case where if they're charging a truck, they have to, you know, not turn on too many lights and not turn the microwave on. Otherwise, the circuit breakers will trip. So there are, little learnings that that people have to consider. But as much as the truck, it's the infrastructure at the facility that really gives you the full EV experience and the full benefit of the lower cost of ownership. If you're able to produce some of your own energy and manage it carefully during off-peak times into your truck, that's the best way to manage your costs.
Right, now, during your presentation, Greg, you brought up an image that had a number of different types of vehicles, from garbage trucks to tippers to cherry pickers. From your professional point of view, what applications make the most sense right now?
Let's see. We can approach it from industry sectors. So let's say government instrumentalities, municipalities is a very easy sector to conceptualize. They have a depot. They go out during the day, parks and gardens, refuse and rubbish, road repairs, line markings, sign repairs, those sorts of things. Ideal application for an electric truck. If you then look at first mile and last mile, the obvious first mile is refuse, garbage pickup. The obvious last mile is consumer goods delivered to your house. So whether you're talking an IKEA or an Amazon or a Woolworths or a Coles, think of those little trucks that you see trundling around and reimagine them as electric vehicles. And you can then move further into road maintenance. That vehicle I showed you that had, 240 volt power system recharges, that's actually a road maintenance vehicle. It's got all sorts of signs and goodness knows what else all over it, and witches' hats and so on, that drives along and keeps the folks that are the road gang, so to speak, fully equipped. In some cases, we've got another one that's got one of those big signs that says, move to the left or move to the right, that's folded up on the back of the vehicle that's telling you, there's a lane closed up ahead. So those sorts of vehicles, perfect application for them as well.
Right.
So there's lots of industry segments and lots of applications for our vehicles today. Right.
Okay. Now, Glenn, I realised I've called you Greg a couple of times, so you should feel free to call me Nick or Rick.
That's quite all right. You're not the first to call me something other than my name, I can assure you.
Whatever you prefer works with me. Wolfgang, you have a much clearer name to remember. Let's talk about battery swaps for a moment. What does the kind of prospect of battery swaps, for example, mean for small business? Is it a welcome prospect?
I think very much so. Simply if we are in a commercial environment, some of our targets with our LEVs are commercial environments, and again, we are looking at the last mile deliveries in suburban environments as well as in the cities. A lot of the big trucks, and sorry, Glenn, but some of the big trucks these days with e-commerce, they are driving around with two little parcels carrying iPhones, and have nothing else in them. So the other thing too is that these days we're looking at 1 hour deliveries for some of the e-commerce areas and so forth. So any commercial vehicle has to be available 24/7. And with a fixed battery, you just can't do that, because, look, 230 kilometers with a truck, if that's the route it takes, that's fine. But for us, we are looking at batteries with a range of about 50 kilometers. But most of the applications are a back-to-base application. And therefore, if you come back to base, you swap the battery, you off again for the next 50 kilometers and so forth. Just a little comment there to Glenn as well. I find it so interesting, that you talk about applications as well, because I don't think we are in the electric vehicles game. We are in the applications game. We are in the game of finding applications or converting people and saying, look, this is actually the better choice. This is the better choice, having an electric vehicle, and we also talk a lot about the CO2. in terms of the greenhouse gases. But what we're forgetting is that within urban environments, there's more deaths from emission-related diseases than there are car accident victims. And we don't have million-dollar campaigns, to reduce those emissions. And that's really where I'm coming from. Sometimes having an electric car with an electric motor in it does not help us with congestion. It doesn't help us with the parking problems. And as I said before, it stands around for 95% of the time doing nothing, driven by one person for 35 kilometers a day. So it is a little bit of a rethinking not only the vehicle itself, but also the infrastructure around it. And that's what I think is one of the key things for the light electric vehicles within Australia.
Right. So Wolfgang, in that sense, and this is a question both to you and Glenn, what do you think the main roadblocks are to getting mass usage of light EVs in Australia? What are the things standing in our way primarily?
From my point of view, we are a country of 25 million people. We have an island continent almost the size of all of America. And we have regulations across one country, which is equal to having 8 individual countries. And to give you an example, so mopeds, which are limited to 50 kilometers an hour, can be driven on a normal car license in Queensland, Western Australia, South Australia, and the Northern Territory. In New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, and the ACT, you will need a motorcycle license. So that's one of the things. The differences in registration, we welcome very much that the ACT will later this year have no registration fees for electric vehicles, and a grant and subsidy of $10,000 per electric vehicle, half of it which will be a grant, the other half which will be at 0% interest. And these are the things which we're grappling with, and getting out there.
In our case, Mick, it's two things. In the case of, say, a municipality or a government instrumentality, it's the difference between capital expenditure and operating expenditure. Operating expenditure is a recurrent thing year on year. It's part of your budgeting process. Capital expenditure is that thing that you ask for once a year and someone gives you a pot of money. And the challenge in that environment is you need to change your bias of funding allocation away from your operating budget to your capital expense budget. And that requires some change of thinking within the funding arrangements of those municipalities. So that's number one. Number two, in the more, I'll call it sort of the commercial space, it's about risk. And right now, the challenge for clients and the challenge for us is to create a strong, cogent argument about the whole of life operating costs, and it's worthwhile getting over that final hurdle, and that is do it. And what we really need in our space is some sort of support to those people who are taking that, what they believe is a risk. And that's where public policy can play a role, whatever that form takes.
But in some way, it has to be a cohesive policy across the country, I think, and that's one of my things which I'm missing, and in a lot of ways, we actually have EVs going from the ground up rather than from the top down. We see that companies themselves move, individuals move, local authorities like cities and so forth move, and it goes up and up, and then states move. And or even regions. And then we come to the federal side, and it all falls down.
Mm.
Yeah, we're close to a tipping point, though.
Right, and what that's interesting, Glenn. So that tipping point, the key driver for that tipping point, what will that be?
Numbers,
just straight numbers.
There's two elements to that. You know, we've put 90 some on the road in Australia, and we've got another 65 on order. But once we get the larger park out there, once we get the greater acceptance, once they become normalized, that's when things will start to change. They work. They just work. And the more people who realize that and come to accept that, the easier it'll be to accept.
Look, gentlemen, I'm going to have to wrap it there. Time waits for no person, and it's certainly not waiting for us. Thank you so much to Glen Walker from C Electric and Wolfgang Roffmann from EMOS. It's been a really interesting presentation. It's very thought-provoking with lots of practical elements too. So thank you on behalf of the people tuning in and from me too. I'd also like, as we say farewell, to once again thank our sponsors, our principal sponsor, Bank Australia, our major sponsor, NRMA, and our community sponsors, Innova Community Energy, Light Touch, Solar and Electrical, and Club Car. I'd also like to thank the team who have worked to produce this webinar, our IT person, Glenn Todd, Bridie Schmidt, Muriel Watt, Christabel Munson, and Chris Sanderson. Now, our next webinar, which will be number 7 in the series, is on Tuesday, the 2nd of March, and the theme that night will be electric bikes and personal transport. Not everyone wants or needs to drive a car, so come along on the 2nd of March at 6 p.m. and find out about personal modes of electric transport. Also in planning, a post-COVID live EV Expo and Forum mid-2021. Check out the Zero Emissions Byron website for details. That's all the w's/zerobyron.org/webinars. Zero Emissions Byron has now staged 6 free monthly webinars since August 2020. Why electric vehicles, making the switch, charging ahead, and EV conversions, going the distance, and tonight's Electrifying Your World. We're attracting interest from all states and overseas, for which we're greatly appreciative, and each 1-hour webinar is available to watch on YouTube. You can find links to all of them at www.zerobyron.org/webinars. I'm Mick O'Regan. It's been a great pleasure to moderate tonight's webinar. I look forward to your company again on Tuesday, the 2nd of March.